Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
History doesn't have to be boring, buttoned up, or inaccessible. And it certainly didn't end in 1945. It belongs to all of us, and we share and add to it every day. Welcome to the History A Go-Go podcast, where I interview interesting guests, cover a motley crew of topics, and it's a place where you can sit, think, and drink all at the same time. I'm your host, Rob Mellon.
Then the fine people of Quincy honored me by electing me their representative to Congress. I was reelected twice, and after that second election then, the legislature appointed me or elected me to the Senate, representing the great state of Illinois.
My guest today is historian and author Reg Ankrom. He says Abraham Lincoln introduced him to Stephen A. Douglas. His newfound interest in Lincoln led to an interest in the men and women who influenced him, Douglas among them. The discovery that Douglas landed in Jacksonville, Illinois, Ankrom's hometown, developed the interest that led to the author's first book, Stephen A. Douglas, The Political Apprenticeship, 1833 to 1843. The first of three he intends to write in the study of Douglas. Ankrom is also a frequent speaker and lecturer on Douglas, Lincoln, and antebellum America. His most recent work is Stephen A. Douglas, Western Man, The Early Years in Congress, 1844 to 1850. Of the book, Douglas Edgerton, author of A Year of Meteors, Stephen A. Douglas, Abraham Lincoln, and the Election That Brought on the Civil War, writes, in this second volume, gifted biographer Reg Ankrom chronicles the rise of the able, ambitious Douglas, who arrived in Washington at the age of 31 and quickly gained fame as an eloquent critic of the Free Soil movement and became one of the key architects of the Compromise of 1850. Elegantly written and deeply researched, Ankrom's meticulously textured volumes will long stand as the definitive life of Douglas. And we are very pleased to have the historian and writer with us today. Welcome, Reg.
Thanks, Rob. It's great to be with you again.
So I got to ask you, does Jane now live with Reg Ankrom and Stephen A. Douglas, or just Reg?
Well, maybe neither one. I mean, we don't see one another very much.
Yeah. Reg, it is tradition here to accompany the discussion with a special brew. Today we have the Calling Double IPA from Boulevard Brewing Company of Kansas City, Missouri. The Calling is an undeniable IPA from Boulevard's Smokestack series. It is their tribute to the like-minded dreamers, adventurous spirits, and glass-half-full optimists just like Stephen A. Douglas. Bursting forth with unmistakable tropical fruit and pine hop aromas and delicious flavors, Boulevard asks you to heed your call and enjoy. Remember, the best way to enjoy an episode is with one of our featured brews. I would also like to ask you to subscribe to the podcast. All you got to do is hit the subscribe button on the directory that you use and get that new material immediately when it's published. Subscribing is the only way to get those new shows right away. To the ever-expanding list of supporters and listeners from over 60 countries and hundreds of cities across the United States and the globe, I have to say thank you. And now I raise my The Calling Double IPA very high. And to the unbounded energy and political astuteness of the Little Giant, I have to say cheers. Douglas has a role in protecting the Mormons. Of course, the Mormons come to the shores of Illinois in 1838 and 1839. They come into Quincy, and he has a role. And of course, other Quincyans that have a role in that as well. Could you talk about that role that he specifically plays and the reasonings behind it?
Sure. He had arrived in Quincy in very early March. I think it was March 2nd of 1840. And shortly before that, Joseph Smith, the founder and the prophet of the Mormon Church, was released or escaped. That's unclear to me. But anyway, from Liberty Jail in Missouri, where he had been ensconced because of what the Missouri governor considered a capital punishment. He accused Joseph Smith and 3 others of treason, which was a capital offense. They could have been hung for it. So anyway, Smith was in Illinois. He got to Illinois actually in April of 1839, Douglas arriving in March of 1840 as a new judge and an associate justice of the Illinois Supreme Court. And it was within 2 months that Governor Thomas Ford of Illinois, and a Quincyan, by the way, had gotten an extradition order or request from the state of Missouri. And it had been sent to be executed, and the sheriff of Adams County at the time could not find Joseph Smith, so he sent it back to Springfield saying he couldn't execute it, and so he signed it, and it went back to Ford. Well, the case came before Judge Douglas in a court, and of course there were, I think, 11 counties in this judicial district at the time, so it went back to Judge Douglas in a northern part of the district court, and the judge threw it out. And the reason was, when he was asked to enforce the extradition order, the reason was he said the sheriff had actually executed the order and signed it, and it was a non-order because he couldn't find Joseph Smith. So Douglas said that order had been executed, and it was no longer valid as a continuing order. And so that freed Joseph Smith, and Joseph Smith and the Mormons from that point on, even until after Joseph Smith died at Carthage Jail a few years later, loved Stephen Douglas. And Smith wrote this edict, which you can find in the Joseph Smith papers online, calling Stephen Douglas a master spirit of our church. And his friends are our friends, and we will never forget, this is the Mormon prophet speaking, we will never forget what he's done for us. And so there was the assurance to Douglas that Douglas could count on the votes, which were 5,700 votes in Nauvoo at the time, and was growing continually, if he ever needed them. That's really the reason Douglas got here to Quincy. When he was appointed as Supreme Court Justice in late February of 1840, he asked to be sent to Quincy. And that was the reason, because he had earlier served as Secretary of State long enough to sign the charter for the city of Nauvoo. It had been Commerce City on the Mississippi River. And of course, when the Mormons were looking for a place to stay, a place to establish the new Zion, as they called it, they found Commerce City. They approached the state, and Douglas and another guy named Adam Snyder, who was from southwestern Illinois, wrote the bill, which passed the Senate and the House, that made Commerce City the city of Nauvoo. Again, that was where the first contact had occurred for Joseph Smith. But the love, the master spirit, came when Douglas saved Smith from having to be extradited back to Missouri.
Well, most of your book, and in fact, it says the early years in Congress, 1844 to 1850, he gets elected to Congress. Initially, he had attempted to run against John Todd Stewart, who was Lincoln's law partner, I believe.
That's right.
He's unsuccessful, but he challenges Stewart to a point that most people wouldn't think was possible at that time. He only lost by, I think, 36 votes.
Yes, out of 36,000.
Right.
Yeah.
So when he finally gets elected, how does he get elected to Congress? I guess he's living in Quincy at the time.
He's living in Quincy at the time. He's been serving now for 2.5 years as that Supreme Court justice and the circuit judge in the 5th Judicial Circuit. So by that time, he had actually tried to run for Congress, which, as you say, was against John Todd Stewart, who in 1837 became Lincoln's law partner. And he also sought the Senate, even before he was old enough to serve in the Senate. And he actually made a good run for it, was beaten by Sidney Breese of Southern Illinois, who pleaded with him not to run against him because Douglas had formed the Democratic Party in Illinois and was extremely powerful as a very young man. And at the age of 29, ran for the U.S. Senate against Breese. And that's when Breese suggested he not run, and he would promise him that he would get the next opportunity when the next Senate seat from Illinois opened. So by that time, he's now a judge in Quincy, and once he decides he's nominated, actually, by a Democratic meeting in Griggsville, and he was actually holding court in Knox County, I believe it was Knox County, when he was told that he had been nominated for Congress by the Democrats in Griggsville. And his Whig opponent was Orville Hickman Browning, who was a very good friend of Lincoln and known as one of the best lawyers in Western Illinois. And he and Lincoln, would exchange cases wherever they were. Lincoln was operating out of Springfield, which is where the Supreme Court was. And there was a lot of business here on the west side of Illinois with the development of land sales and so on. So anyway, Douglas runs against Orville Hickman Browning, and they made a unique promise. They promised one another that they were sure the race would get tough and neither of them would subside from any issue, but they promised each other that they would remain gentlemen, that it wouldn't become a personally vindictive race. And Hickman Browning wrote after the contest had been won by Douglas that Douglas had kept the promise. And Orville Hickman Browning said, I hope that Douglas feels the same way about me. But it was a very hard-fought race. The boundary of the congressional district was roughly the same as the judicial district, so Douglas knew it very well. He had been in the courtrooms of each county seat within that district. And as I say, I believe there were 11 of them. So he was politicking when he was out on the circuit as a judge. And when he and Orville Hickman Browning ran against one another, they started conducting joint debates. And this was, roughly 20 years, 22 years, 23 years before the great debates between Douglas and Lincoln. And so they were conducting joint debates. They would travel together. They had meals together. They, in some cases, slept together in the same bed. That was common among candidates at the time. And, of course, they would debate for as long as 3 and 4 hours. Typically, they did what Lincoln and Douglas did, which was what Douglas suggested in 1858. The opener would have an hour. The opponent would then have 90 minutes, and the guy who opened would have an additional 30 minutes. So they each had 90 minutes. So those debates ran at least 3 hours and then longer. They operated at Browning's request 40 days straight.
Wow.
40 days in a row they did this, going from one town to another, and in a time or in a case or two, twice in one town. But in any case, they would debate each other every day except Sunday, and that was at Browning's request. He was a spiritual man and didn't want to work on the Sabbath, and so they didn't. So for 40 straight days, they debated. By the end of that 40-day period, newspapers in Quincy were saying, these guys are so exhausted, they look dead. And in fact, the Democrats in Quincy started a rumor that Orville Hickman Browning had actually died before the election to collect whatever votes might be independent or swing votes, if there were at the time.
Was he going to reemerge then?
Well,
after the election?
Browning did go to bed. I mean, he was exhausted. He was in bed for like a week. I mean, you get up and do whatever you have to do, but he was literally exhausted. But they didn't believe Douglas could win the race. He won the race by about 400 votes out of the tens of thousands that were cast. And so Douglas, in August of 1843, is elected to Congress. He's 30 years old. He gets to Congress on December 4th, or gets to Washington, D.C., December 4th of 1843. And the next day, the 28th Congress convenes. He is the youngest congressman there. And in 1847, when he became a senator, when he was introduced to the Senate, he was the youngest senator there as well. So you can kind of get a sense of the power that the guy had. First in Illinois as a young man, he and a guy named S.S. Brooks had created the Democratic Party, and the Whigs hated it. Lincoln called it un-American. But Douglas started that party with S.S. Brooks and got himself elected chairman of the Central Committee. And from there, it was all easily uphill, but more easily than Lincoln would have. And Lincoln ultimately and the Whigs finally decided they can't do it without a party themselves. So that's when they created the Whig Party in Illinois. They still struggled getting elected, but they figured they had to do it.
So Douglas takes over, and there's a lot of stuff going on at that time. He gets involved in an election crisis, I guess.
Huge.
But there's all kinds of other things going on. The gag rule is there to table slavery, and then there's issues of expansion. So what are some of those issues that he encounters when he enters Congress for the first time?
Well, I want to start by saying in my book, the word slavery appears 743 times. And the book, with notes and bibliography and index, it's about nearly 400 pages long. But that word really tells you what you need to know about the book, because what Douglas found when he got there was a constitutional crisis, and slavery was behind it. The crisis was that the Whigs, one of the few times ever, controlled the Congress 2 years before Douglas got there, and they wrote what was called the Whig Law. That law said, instead of electing congressmen, and that was a federal law, instead of electing congressmen by statewide election, or what were called general elections, they would have to be elected by district. Illinois had already decided to do that some years earlier, and most states had done that some years earlier. And why would the Whigs pass such a law? It was because the Democrats were scattered all across states. Whigs might be centralized in a few locations, in Illinois, for example, in the Alton area, Lyman Trumbull and Gustav Kerner and so on and so forth. But they couldn't win a statewide election. And in fact, in 1840, there were 5 Whigs that went to Lincoln in 1840 and asked him to run for governor in 1842. And Lincoln said, "Gentlemen, I won't do that." And I'm paraphrasing here. It's because a Whig will never win office statewide in Illinois. And he was right about that. There was one exception. It had to do with Alexander Field, who was Secretary of State, who became a Whig. He had been a Democrat and became a Whig. And he and Douglas went round and round. Douglas fought that in the Supreme Court, saying that's unrepublican for a man to think he can hold office and then change office and so on. There was a big story about that. That's in the first book, so I won't cover that here. So Douglas gets there, and the Whigs have this law, and when he gets to Congress, I love the guy, Willie Mangum, who's a poker-faced guy from North Carolina. He was the Senate leader. He gets his Senate organized, and he says, "Okay, gentlemen, we'll adjourn until the House organizes." And if you kind of think like a camera and see the House, it's breaking out. It's all hell breaking loose. And I can kind of see Douglas smiling because this was a great challenge and a constitutional challenge. And after a while, John Jones, a guy from Virginia, is elected House Speaker. He immediately appoints the 30-year-old youngest congressman, Stephen Douglas, to find some kind of resolution to this problem. And the reason he looked to Douglas was because he knew Douglas had spent 2.5 years as an Illinois Supreme Court justice. He knew what law was. He knew how to write opinions and knew how to find opinions and resolutions. So in a matter of 2 or 3 weeks, Douglas actually took that issue. And the issue was that 4 states refused to follow the Whig law. Instead of electing by district, they continued to elect statewide. And it was a big deal because there were 22 congressmen whose seats were now unfillable until they could solve this problem. And of course, the South was fighting it because these were states in which more northern congressmen could be seated. So Douglas takes a look at he goes back to the delegates' discussion in the Constitutional Convention in 1787. Douglas was a historian. He was a researcher, and he knew how to, of course, lawyers have to be researchers. So he knew how to research the issue. And he came back in January, I believe it was January 22nd. This issue was started December 5th when they were trying to seat congressmen. So it was like 3 weeks later. He comes back with what was called a report, which he presented to the House of Representatives. And to make a long story short, Douglas simply concluded, as he did, that nowhere in the Constitution is the Congress authorized to tell a state how to elect its own representatives. And that was a condition that held. The House was able to organize it after Douglas's opinion. And from what I have been studying Douglas, from what I see in that opinion, was a principle that Douglas carried until the day he died. He was a demagogue. He was a sophist. He would say things that served his purpose, but never from that point on did he change that principle that the Congress could do things that were authorized only by the Constitution. They could only do it when it was authorized by the Constitution. The Constitution said all other issues or matters or questions were left to the states. Douglas made that point very strongly in saying the government could not tell a state how to elect its own representatives, and that was a principle he stayed with. And so while he did say whatever served him at whatever time, and many congressmen were doing that, I mean, they were all interested in advancing issues or advancing themselves, he didn't change that fact. And that became a major fact throughout his attempts to organize territories, later on including Kansas and Nebraska. It would become most important.
So this is a time of intense nationalism, even for both parties, actually,
yes.
For the Democrats and the Whigs. Now, they viewed it in completely different ways. The Whigs are more about economic expansion. The Democrats want territorial expansion. Not that some Whigs didn't want that as well. So what's the basic philosophy of Douglas's nationalism?
Well, there were several reasons Douglas was wanting to expand the nation. In the first place, he campaigned on it here in the Quincy area. When he and Browning were out, he was campaigning on the line, the expansion of the nation is the expansion of liberty. From Douglas's standpoint, he ran on that basis. The second reason was, he said, I want to create an ocean-bound republic. At the time he enters Congress, only 2 states had been organized, and they're both just west of the Mississippi. One is Arkansas, and the other is Missouri. Everything else west of the Mississippi was open territory, including more than 500,000 square miles that belonged to Mexico. And Texas was trying to come in, but the Congress wouldn't let Texas in because of slavery, the issue of slavery. Anyway, so Douglas says, I want to build an ocean-bound republic. And the important thing he said was his third point, without red lines on the map. When he got there, Britain, France, and Spain were trying to make inroads in the South. Britain particularly was trying to get into Texas because they were trying to abolitionize, and the South was very opposed to British interests because of that. They had freed slaves in a decision that actually came just before the Revolutionary War. It freed every slave in Britain. The South still had slavery as a British colony. What would happen to their slaves? And so they were very much opposed to the British having anything to do with interests here in the United States. So the result was that was Douglas, who wanted to expand liberty and wanted to remove, these foreign interests from the continent. And so he did that. What he knew he was going to face was slavery on one side, abolition on the other. Abolitionists were already growing. I mean, here in Quincy, we had Dr. Richard Eales before Douglas left here. In fact, it was Douglas who found Richard Eales guilty of harboring a fugitive slave, violating an Illinois law, and a case that went to the U.S. Supreme Court later on. And Eales was dead by that time, and Douglas was actually 5 or 6 years later U.S. Senator. So in any case, Douglas was interested in expanding the nation because he didn't want foreign interests involved here. He also believed there was great commercial value on the west side of the nation in trade with China, with Asian nations, and so on. John Jacob Astor had started the American company trading furs overseas and ultimately trading opium, which led to the Opium Wars and so on and so forth. So he saw great commercial value. He was very interested, he was one of the first directors of the Smithsonian Institution. He was very much interested in technology, was big for railroads, and part of the reason for Kansas, Nebraska was to provide a route to the West Coast for railroads. So there were all kinds of reasons he had for wanting to go west. I would say largely they were expansive and vote-getting. What he sensed among young men, and it became a wing of the Democratic Party, was this tremendous lust for land and growth in territory and so on and so forth. And from that, Douglas literally developed what became the Young America movement in the country, and in 1848 was named as a candidate for presidency in the Democratic Party. I mean, he'd been in Congress 4 years when he's strong enough to be considered a candidate for the presidency, a guy who is 34 years old. And he deferred, of course, to James Knox Polk. In 1852, he's named even more strongly, and he defers to Franklin Pierce. In 1856, he's named again, defers to James Buchanan, because each time he thinks, I'm young enough, I'm going to have my shot. And 1860 was the shot he was aiming at when his friend from Illinois happened to win that election. So he kept gaining strength all the way across a very quick landscape that he was developing almost single-handedly.
So your book is broken up into 3 parts. Mm-hmm. The first part is about how to successfully get Texas into the Union, with all of the controversies that were going on with that.
Right.
The second part is Oregon, with some of the issues that you talked about with the British are also involved with their influence in Oregon, which was split. Basically, they were cohabitation in Oregon. So can we go back to that first part, though? What role does Douglas play in getting Texas into the Union?
It's so simple. Here's Texas, which had freed itself from Mexico during a war that was in 1835. Texas now is an independent republic, which means they're a country. I mean, they're a country of their own, but they were carrying like a $10 million debt from that war. They wanted to join the Union, and the South wanted them to join the Union, basically to get rid of that debt. They had freed themselves from Mexico, but they still carried this huge debt, which was just overwhelming for the state, or at that time, the nation. And so they try to get in. The South works like crazy to get them in, particularly John C. Calhoun. Calhoun had been a vice president. He's now, for John Tyler, the Secretary of State. He's working like crazy to get them in. It took a treaty passed by the U.S. Senate to bring another country into the nation. If you had territory, you just organize the territory, bring it in. But if you're dealing with an independent country, as Texas was, it required a treaty of the U.S. Senate. And what Douglas did, it just wouldn't happen. And the reason basically was slavery. John C. Calhoun, for example, made a huge faux pas when he said, the South wants this nation for slavery. They wanted to expand slavery, continue it on west, and that's where Texas was. And there were many Democrats, even Northern Democrats, who wanted Texas, but not for that purpose. What people like the gentleman who coined the phrase manifest destiny, John O'Sullivan, who had the American Democratic Magazine, he wanted Texas because he believed it would pull slaves in, and he saw Texas as a funnel south. The big thought by many Northern Democrats was the slaves would be pulled to the west and then taken south. So there was interest among even Northern Democrats for Texas to get rid of slavery. But Calhoun wanted Texas for slavery. He made the mistake of saying that publicly, and that skewed any opportunity he might have to get a treaty passed by the U.S. Senate. Well, Douglas comes in. He's a constitutional lawyer. He had been an Illinois Supreme Court justice, and he knew the ins and outs and the nuances and some of the things about law that we would never think of. Douglas, who was so young, he didn't think he'd have the moxie to do what he did, goes to a guy named Brown. I believe Brown was a congressman from New Hampshire. And he said, instead of trying to get 2/3 vote in the Senate for passage of a treaty, all it would take is 51% in the two houses. And so Douglas wrote a joint resolution, which he got Brown to carry, and that resolution passed, which made Texas a state, which brought Texas into the Union on the basis of a joint resolution. He avoided the treaty process entirely. So now Texas comes into the Union. And part of the story in part one, there's also the story of Andrew Jackson. It was a marvelous maneuver that he pulled to get Jackson exempted from a $1,000 fine that he'd already paid and the record expunged, which Jackson hated tremendously because he thought, I've been the president of the United States and I'm in violation of the law. He was found guilty in a court of law. He was cited for contempt, failing to follow a judge's order. So can I get to that in a moment? Let me finish Texas. So Texas is now in the Union, and this problem with Andrew Jackson now pops up. And Democrats had been trying ever since Jackson had left office to get a measure passed that would refund him his money. He paid a $1,000 fine, and to expunge the record of this contempt of court. It all related when Jackson had been the general in the Battle of New Orleans. The War of 1812 had actually ended when that battle was fought, and a judge named Dominic Hall ordered Jackson to lift a law that closed the town down. And Jackson refused to do it because he thought the British were still close by and they had attacked once, and he and his band of rebels and so on had thwarted them. So the judge made this order. Jackson refuses, and the judge finds Jackson in contempt of court, fines him $1,000, which Jackson paid. Many Democrats had tried to get that taken care of, and Douglas did. Douglas came in, and in fact, he started prosecuting in a sense. Douglas had once been a prosecutor too. The judge who found him guilty. The key thing was Douglas pointed out that the court was not even in session when Judge Hall did this. And so it was moot. And there was a number of other legal issues involved, which I describe in the book. Long story short, Douglas then got the Congress to refund Jackson his $1,000 with 6% interest. And so Jackson ended up getting it'd been like 30 years or 20, 25 years, got like $5,000 back from the Congress. But more importantly, he got the record expunged. Now, a year or so later, Douglas is attending a internal improvements convention in Nashville, Tennessee. And while there, he just has to see the man who's been his hero since he was a little boy in Brandon, Vermont, and that's Andrew Jackson. Douglas's own father had died when Douglas was less than 3 months old. And in a sense, Andrew Jackson became the surrogate father figure for Douglas. So he goes to the Hermitage and, outside of Nashville, and he stands in the line that's just snaked around the Hermitage and gets onto the porch and then walks into this large room, the first room you enter as you go into the Hermitage. And there is sitting Andrew Jackson, weak. His eyes are weak. He can hardly see. A retired U.S. Senator from South Carolina is introducing people that he knows as they're passing Jackson, and they're shaking Jackson's hand and so on and so forth. And the senator introduces Congressman Stephen Douglas from Illinois. And Jackson sort of lifts his head, he perks up a bit, and he says to Stephen Douglas, "Are you the man who saved my reputation?" And Douglas said, "Well, I did work on that bill, which we got passed, and yes, sir." And Jackson says, "Sit down, please." And he said, "I want you to know how much I appreciate that." He said, "You have saved my reputation for my grandchildren." And Jackson had that document made available at his funeral, asked that it be distributed so people would know that what had happened had been expunged and that he was no longer in violation of a law of the United States over which he presided as president for 8 years. So he was very happy to meet Douglas. And of course, you can imagine Douglas teared up.
Oh, yeah, I can see that. Yeah.
Yeah, he was very moved by the meeting. And it was not long after that Jackson, died. So it was a very important event.
So that takes us to the election of 1844, and James K. Polk is elected. And as part of that campaign is Oregon. He has this phrase, it's famous campaign slogan for that election, 54-40 or fight. That isn't actually what happens, because eventually when Oregon is brought into the United States, it's at the 49th parallel. So how does Douglas navigate that? How does he help get Oregon into the Union and then save Polk politically, because he had established this during the campaign of 54-40?
There are so many pieces to that. That's why Oregon is really the second part of the book.
It's a big part of it, too.
There's so many pieces. Douglas worked hard for Polk. Polk was like a dark horse candidate.
Right,
there were other candidates, including Stephen Douglas, whose names were in the convention and so on and so forth. And Martin Van Buren had expected to be nominated. He couldn't win nomination, and there were reasons. Part of it was
panic and
financial and other. And so anyway, James Knox Polk gets nominated, and Douglas did push hard for him and worked hard for his election. Douglas was a very hard worker for Democratic candidates. In 1840, Lincoln was the chairman of the Harrison campaign in Illinois. Douglas was the chairman of the Martin Van Buren campaign in Illinois. Van Buren won only 2 states. One was Illinois. So Douglas was very strong in working, hard for his candidates. He worked very hard for James Knox Polk, and of course Polk gets elected and immediately forgets 54-40 or fight, which was Douglas's big deal. Expansion, and the more the merrier. That land belongs to us and we ought to take it. That's exactly what Douglas said. And he downplayed the Treaty of Ghent, which provided for what you were talking about, the double occupation of that territory. And Douglas pointed out why that treaty was invalid and why that land actually belonged to the United States. And he went back, and I introduced the reason myself with the guy who really could claim that land, or the reason the United States could claim that land, because of the finding of this young man from the East. So he worked hard for Knox Polk. Polk, once he gets elected, really ignores Stephen Douglas.
I noticed that.
He ignored him, and it was hurtful. I mean, it's hard to say it, but it was hurtful for Stephen Douglas, personally hurtful. And he was embarrassed by it. I mean, here this guy, the most powerful guy in Illinois, really, who should have had, number one, patronage appointments. People were saying Douglas deserved appointments from Illinois to the cabinet, and people were kind of expecting Douglas would be appointed to the cabinet. Polk paid him no attention. The result of all of that was that Douglas decides, I'm just going to leave the Congress. I'm ignored. He's embarrassed. He's insulted. And so he decides he's going to leave the Congress. He gets back in touch with John J. Hardin, the guy from whom he took the first office when Douglas was, got to Illinois at the age of 20. He literally kicked out of office John J. Hardin, who was the state's leading Whig from Jacksonville, Illinois. He was a shirt-tailed relative, the nephew of Henry Clay. And so he's a pretty potent guy. Douglas pulls this maneuver to get Hardin kicked out of office, and then he becomes the state prosecutor in that same district, which was Jacksonville and central part of Illinois. So anyway, he and Hardin had become friends afterward. I mean, Hardin actually appreciated Douglas' abilities, and Douglas appreciated Hardin. So Douglas writes to Hardin and says, I am ready, and Hardin had asked him already, I am ready to become your aide-de-camp. The Mexican War is developing. I am ready to become your aide-de-camp and join you in war. And Hardin says, great, why don't you contact all your other Illinois colleagues, congressmen, and have them assure that you can get a commission. Douglas does that, and all of them write letters to Polk. That's when he finds out that his young protege, Douglas, wants to leave Congress, and Polk finds out he's that upset. Polk calls him to the White House, and it's an evening meeting, and Douglas starts railing about all the insults and the lack of attention and, the work that he had done for him, blah, blah, blah. And Polk says to him, I've seen the letters. If you will stay in Congress, you will be my representative in the House of Representatives. So Douglas now, his pride is now boosted by Polk saying that Douglas would be the guy, the spokesman in the House of Representatives for the administration. That's when Douglas decides to stay. And he works hard for Oregon. he makes the commitment, instead of 5440, to the 49th parallel. And what you learn in the book is you'll find out that it was James Buchanan, who later Douglas yields to in 1856, who then was the Secretary of State for James Knox Polk. Polk appointed him. And it was Polk who he believed that if there was any intention of taking more than the 49th parallel, there would be another war with Britain. And Douglas finds that out, and he tries to persuade Polk that won't happen. Douglas was close enough to the British ambassador to know that Britain was already fighting 2 wars on the continent. They weren't about to, and Douglas made this point, go that much farther west to fight the United States over a piece of territory that they really don't want anyway. And Douglas had been told by Ambassador Pakenham that they didn't want it. But Polk yielded to the advice of his Secretary of State, James Buchanan, and gave up on 5440 for the 49th parallel instead. Now, the thing about this is, all of this is, the first part of the book is about Texas. And what I wanted to do there was to show how mechanical Douglas was in engineering Texas into the Union. You know, he did that in about 3 weeks from the time he got to Washington, D.C. Oregon was an entirely different story. He worked like crazy to bring Oregon in. And even though Oregon had no chance for slavery, you know, the conditions just obviated slavery, the South didn't want it in. They got Texas. Now they could care less about Oregon. The Southerners had made a promise, nothing in writing, of course, but you help us bring Texas in, we'll make sure you get Oregon. They completely turned away from that promise. And so it took Douglas about 8 to 9 years to get Oregon in. So we see him very quickly maneuvering to get Texas in, and we see his persistence and constancy in working for Oregon, and no matter what was going to happen, he was going to bring it in. Now, I asked myself the question, why in the world would he spend so much time and attention and energy on Oregon? What I found out was interesting, and this is in the book. I found out that 2 of the first 3 wagon trains that went to Oregon were from Quincy, Illinois, and they were the heart of his district. They were young men. There were 2 young men from the Mission Institute, and they were ministers. Neither had been married. Interestingly, there was a book of available women. The American Home Institute required missionaries going west to be married. These 2 young men from the Mission Institute were not. But there was a book the Home Society had of available women who indicated interest in being married. And these 2 guys go to St. Louis. They find these women, marry them, bring them back, and now the wagons, they take off for Oregon. The other was also in his district, and that was a train from Peoria. A quite interesting story. How would people get interested from here in Oregon? There were 2 people, a man and a young Native American, who came to Quincy to speak about organizing the West and particularly Oregon. And that's how Douglas's interest developed in Oregon, just by hook and by crook, finding out that 2 of the first trains were interested in going were from his own home community.
So how did Douglas become a senator then? So he enters the Congress, very momentous time, as you indicated, and he's a very young man, and then he's still a young man, and he's elected by the state legislature to the Senate.
Well, it all goes back to what he did initially. That was to create the Democratic Party. He created an organization that he controlled, and he won. After his control, he won election actually 3 times. His first election, 1843, was a 1-year term, and then he was elected to 2 2-year terms. And at the beginning of his 3rd term, the Illinois General Assembly now, you know, as I said, he tried to become a senator like 4 or 5 years earlier. James Semple was retiring, the senator, and he said, I was just glad. He said he'd never been happier about leaving politics. That seat opens up, and there's Douglas to fill it, and the Illinois General Assembly, mostly Democrats, controlled by Stephen Douglas. At least, when I say control, I mean friendly, and there was no reason to dislike him because he was a true Democrat, and he made sure that they had patronage and so on and so forth, so they appreciated Douglas too. They appoint, by a vote of the legislature, the 2 houses come together. Senators weren't elected in public elections. They were elected by the General Assembly at that time. So the 2 houses elected Stephen Douglas in 1847 to the U.S. Senate, where immediately a Committee on the Territories was created for him. He had been the chairman of the Committee on the Territories in the House, and that's how things started getting organized or developing in the West. And now the Senate did the same thing for him in the upper chamber there.
So what role does he play in the Mexican War? You mentioned that initially he was going to possibly serve on Hardin's staff. Of course, that relationship with Polk develops a little stronger than it was before, so that doesn't happen. What role does he play in the Mexican War? And then, of course, at the same time, Abraham Lincoln is serving that single term in Congress in the House of Representatives, and he's against the war. So what's Douglas's role in the war?
Again, that gets complicated because he's serving in the House of Representatives at the beginning, and he's a very strong supporter of Polk, very strong supporter of the war. In fact, Quincy strongly supported the war when he came back between sessions, and this would have been in 1846, I believe. But in any case, he came back, and the Quincy newspapers were talking about the fact that the Mexicans were invading American territory. And at about that time, there was a group of dragoons, United States men, who were traveling, and they were brutalized and mutilated, and, it became a huge story, and I report that in the book. And so Douglas was very much in favor of the war, supporting Polk, and the reason it became complicated was because he fought the introduction of an amendment, which was an amendment to a bill to fund the war called the Wilmot Proviso. And that's where things really started tipping. It was kind of a new, huge controversy because for the first time in taking over land at the end of the war, there was the introduction of a proviso that said slavery would be prohibited in all of that territory. That now divides North and South. The North is gaining population anyway, and the South is getting more and more concerned because they were, even with James Knox Polk, they had controlled Congress, had controlled the government, and made it so. When James Knox Polk was elected, the South got the Democratic Party in the convention to approve a rule that required a presidential candidate to be nominated by at least 2/3 of all the delegates. That's how Douglas lost the initial nomination in 1860, because the South by that time didn't like Douglas because Douglas would not protect slavery. So Douglas was working in behalf of James Knox Polk. When Wilmot comes along, he fights that strongly. His own state orders him to vote for it. And, of course, Douglas was a Jacksonian, and by his own state, these were even Democrats who were ordering it because they were wanting us to find some way to end slavery. And they believed Wilmot was the mechanism to do it at this point. And Douglas didn't believe it was the mechanism to do it, and he fought that until he was ordered to support it. And under the Jacksonian principle of the doctrine of instruction, the senator could be ordered, congressman could be requested. The senator could be ordered because they were an arm of the legislature, really. So they ordered Douglas to support it. And under the doctrine of instruction, he had two choices. He'd either do that or he was required to resign. And this was a guy, his entire goal for his life had been to become a U.S. senator. Now he had the opportunity to become a president. So he wasn't about to resign his Senate position when that happened. So,
as you said earlier, slavery is mentioned 700 sometimes in your book. Douglas has been a lightning rod for that issue. Even modern times, of course, they take his statue out of the state capitol and so forth. What did you find out about his philosophy, and how does that match up what he actually does in the Congress?
It's clear to me that his true philosophy on slavery was established with that very first action he took, and that was with regard to what states have powers to do. He literally changed his view of how the nation had been trying to deal with slavery ever since the founding. In 1787, the Northwest Ordinance, at the same time the Constitution was being written, Thomas Jefferson was writing the Northwest Ordinance. That ordinance in Article 6 said slavery would be prohibited in the Northwest Territory, which would come to include Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Wisconsin, and so on. 6 states, I believe it was altogether. It might have been 5. But slavery would be prohibited there. There was the Missouri Compromise of 1820, in which a line was drawn at the 3630 parallel, and slavery was committed to staying below it, and above it, freedom, liberty. And, there were secession movements. There was the attempt by John C. Calhoun to secede from the Union, take South Carolina out over the huge tariffs, the nullification. And there were other things along the way that were instructing Douglas on what was not working. I mean, the Wilmot Proviso was growing out of the fact that people couldn't accept the other parts. Oregon states were actually putting in the language of Article 6, and it was being opposed. What Douglas finally concluded was what he had learned in that very first action with regard to resolving the constitutional crisis when he got there. And that was, he believed that the Northwest Ordinance, the Missouri Compromise, the way the nullification crisis was resolved and so on, actions by Congress in those issues were unconstitutional. That sounds crazy, and to me, this is sort of new history because we've never thought of Douglas in this way. I hope that people will at least look at what he was suggesting here. Those things didn't work. And in fact, the Constitution did not give Congress the right to say how slavery was going to be moderated. There was nothing in the Constitution about that. And Douglas pointed out, in fact, slavery was written into the Constitution. We hadn't found a way to deal with it yet. But Douglas's point was the ways we had found were unconstitutional. And here's what he pointed to. This is a bit complicated, so bear with me here, Rob.
Go for it.
Here's where he gets to. At the time, the very first bill he introduced in 1845, January of 1845, was the Nebraska Act. And again, for 10 years, he continued to try to push Nebraska to get Nebraska organized. And in most of those times, he attempted to use the Missouri Compromise line, 3630, as a defining line for where slavery goes and where freedom begins. And he found out that they kept kicking it out. The South wouldn't buy into it. The North wouldn't buy into it. And so he reaches this new constitutional theory that it was unconstitutional in the first place. And then the rationale he used was that the Constitution did it. But here was the important thing. The Constitution also provided what was called the Doctrine of Equality. It was an equal provision in the Constitution that whatever institutions the original states had, any new state had a right to. And so the result was when before the Constitution was written, all 13 states had slavery, 13 colonies. And when we became a nation, 12 new states had slavery. And Vermont was the first state to get rid of it in 1777, which Douglas was proud of, by the way. But in any case, those original states had slavery. So what Douglas concluded was the Constitution actually had a provision by which any state could have slavery. And it was a state issue. The state could come in as a slave state. And he had personal experience with that. In Illinois in 1818, when our state came in, they tried to come in as a slave state. A poker-nosed congressman named James Talmadge from New York said, "Gentlemen, don't forget the Article 6 of the Northwest Territory. You can't come in as a slave state." And so the Southern-based legislature decided, okay, we'll come in as a free state, and under the equal footing provision of the U.S. Constitution, we'll make us a slave state later. In 1824, they actually tried to do that. We were a free state when we came in 1818. In 1824, there was a referendum on the ballot that proposed a constitutional convention by which the Constitution would be rewritten to allow Illinois to have slavery. The good news was that was voted down. It actually went to a vote, and by a ratio of 53 to 47, it was voted out. So there was no slavery in Illinois. But Illinois was exercising, as Douglas came to understand, the equal footing provision of the U.S. Constitution, and that was the way slavery could be added or eliminated. And, Mr. Lincoln would always say, but it's allowing an immorality. And Douglas was saying, it's executing the law. And they were wonderful. Lincoln once said, I never had a political thought that didn't begin with the Declaration of Independence.
Correct, yeah.
Douglas would say, but Mr. Lincoln, the Declaration is not law. It's a moral manifesto, and I believe in it, but the Constitution is the law. Where Lincoln was brilliant in his language and the beautiful works he did that emanated from the Declaration, Douglas, the lawyer, was saying, we've got to deal with what the law is telling us is available and what we can access. So he finally concludes, Douglas, that all these ways to try to moderate slavery had actually been unconstitutional. And that's when he starts saying popular sovereignty, by allowing the people to decide when a territory becomes a state, whether they're going to have slavery or not, would get us to where the founders wanted us to be. And George Washington always acknowledged slavery and regretted it, but he said at least we provided a process of amendment that will allow us to get rid of it. Douglas was on that same track. What could happen is, and let's turn to the West here, when Douglas was organizing the West and this great compromise of 1850 was just tearing everybody's hair out, Douglas gets on the floor of the Senate in April of 1850, and he's in a huge debate with Jefferson Davis. And Davis was aggravated. He said, you're not protecting slavery. I mean, he was literally saying to Douglas, what you're doing is not protecting our institution. And Douglas, I think, in a courageous manner, says to Jefferson Davis, you gentlemen of the South, and I'm paraphrasing here, you gentlemen of the South need to realize there are going to be 17 new states organized in this area, what was left to organize west of the Mississippi. He warned his friends of the South, you need to understand, every one of those states will come in as a free state. they were still carrying pistols. Thomas Hart Benton and another senator actually pulled pistols out on the floor of the Senate and aimed at one another. They didn't shoot, fortunately. They got talked down. But I mean, you can see the South just seething when Douglas, who purportedly, as history sort of records, is on the side of the South, saying to Mississippi Senator Henry Foote, and, I was stunned when I read this in the Congressional Globe, if slavery is a blessing, it's your blessing. If it's a curse, it's your curse. On you rests all the responsibility. It's Douglas himself talking about the outrage of slavery, and he's talking about the use of the Constitution determining where it will go. And in Douglas's belief, white men would not pass laws or pass charters of states or constitutions in which slavery would exist. He was right, I would say probably for the wrong reason. He knew from his own experience, both in Jacksonville and Springfield, Quincy and Winchester, white men did not want to live near black men. And the result was they would pass constitutions for free whites. Blacks didn't enter into the picture. So anyway, that's where Douglas changed remarkably. And I think we've kind of failed to recognize the critical importance of what he did. The fact was, Rob, 16 of those 17 states did come in free. Utah was the only one who came in as a slave state and ultimately changed. Douglas was aggravated at Utah. Number one, it came in as a slave state. He called them the twin bastions of infamy, slavery and polygamy. And so Utah did come in that way, and it made Douglas, I wouldn't say a liar, but made him not quite as prescient as we would have thought when he said 17 states would come in free.
Well, thanks, Reg. I really appreciate it. It's a great second volume, and I believe you got a third volume you're working on?
Started number 3. It'll be the final volume in the series, and so thank you, Rob, for having me. It's most interesting to talk about this.
Oh, absolutely. It is very interesting, and I appreciate it. Thanks, Reg. I would like to thank my guest once again today, researcher and author Reg Ankrom. If you would like to get his brand new book, Stephen A. Douglas, Western Man, The Early Years in Congress, 1844 to 1850, the History Museum on the Square at 4th and Main in Quincy has a great price. If you want to get it cheaper than Amazon, head to the History Museum at 332 Main. Our featured brew was the Calling Double IPA from the Smokestack series of the Boulevard Brewing Company of Kansas City, Missouri. And if you liked our talk today, please share this episode with a friend. And remember, as before, subscribe to the podcast. All you have to do, hit that subscribe button on the podcast directory that you use and get those new episodes right away. Subscribing, it's the only way to get them right away. For more information on the podcast, like the History A Go-Go Facebook page or check out the YouTube channel. The music was provided by the great North Carolina band Bones Fork. And if you want to find out more about what they have going on, just click on their link. It's in the description below as well. And once again, to the growing list of listeners and supporters from several countries and hundreds of cities across America, I have to say thank you. There are many more great episodes on the way, with discussions on the wild days of the glam rock bands of the 1980s, the history of the impact of hurricanes, D-Day girls just in time for the anniversary of D-Day, when the Irish invaded Canada, and the presidents versus the press. So join us again next time when we talk, think, and drink on History A Go-Go.
Well, sir, I don't know how anyone could associate the word outlandish with me. I would prefer you call it astute. Now listen, in the 10 years before 1840, the population of Illinois tripled in size. However, the number of judges on the Supreme Court had stagnated since that court was established. I simply wrote a bill that expanded the number of judges to 9. 9 judges would better serve the people, the overall population, and it would make the court work better as well. So that was my small part in that matter.